has an apple that you can reach out, see, and pick and whatnot. But it spends its whole life growing as an apple tree. And so that's the shift that needs to happen in people's mind when it comes to mushrooms is you're not growing apples, you're growing the apple tree. You're not growing the mushrooms, you're growing the mycelium. And if you are successful in growing the mycelium, the fruiting, the mushrooming is actually very fast and it's very easy. Once you have a fully colonized bag like this, there's pretty much nothing you can do wrong at that point. It's literally just poke it, set it, forget it, come back, and it's like, oh, it's like magic, I have a mushroom here. Now there is some things that can optimize that though. You do want to have a humid environment for it to do so. There still is a temperature range you need to maintain for it. That's all going to be on the handout right here of about, I mean, you can go as low as 55 degrees to 60 degrees to as high as 75 degrees to maybe even 80 degrees. But you want a humidity that's over 80%. So what a lot of people do, and what I recommend for your small kits, because it's actually plausible, is once you're fully colonized and you're like, all right, let's do this, and you poke that hole and you engage it, I actually recommend the bathroom next to your shower as the best place for it, because it's getting nice, warm, humid air at least once. Well, during the winter, I fully understand when people only shower like once every other day or something like that. I'm guilty of that myself. But if you're in a multi-family household, then that shower is going to be run at least once a day, which means at least once a day you're going to get a nice humidification going on. And that's way cheaper than trying to humidify your basement or any other room in the house, unless of course you're trying to go big on this. So you can let it go from, you know, sawdust stage through this in your basement and just on a shelf in some random spot. But once you're ready to actually get the mushrooms growing, you can leave it in your basement or you can try taking it up to your shower like I said. So going back about 2 to 5 months and then about 2 weeks, and then at the end of that 2 weeks you'll start to see the spores start to develop on the outside of the mushroom. Once you see those white spores forming on the mushroom, that's an indicator that's probably as big as they're going to get, so you better harvest it now before all that hard work goes to nothing. So there's, I think, one more question. Now actually that young child in the back. Yes, I saw your arm up for a long time, so I want to definitely give a nod to you. Yes?
Can you plant, after they grow somewhat, can you plant them outside?
Yes, that's actually what a lot of people did. When I learned to do mushrooms with a student researcher, that's what he would do. He had like a little mushroom greenhouse, and then once he got his first, what they call first flush, and usually with professional growers you can get about 2 flushes for your thing. And what a flush is, you poke the hole, it grows up a big old mushroom, you harvest it, that's the end of your first flush. Maybe you let it sit a little while and it either maybe sits for a few more months and then fruits again, or maybe it just goes ahead and just throws off another cluster exactly where you just chopped off that first one. That would be your second flush. Most times when you're growing, you're going to get up to 2 flushes and that's it. Sometimes you get lucky with a third, but usually by that point it's tired, it's exhausted, it's dying, and then that aforementioned eternal war that exists between mold and trichoderma just flying in the air, it starts to lose that war because this has an immune system just like us. There's some spores in the air, but we're hoping that it wins out because it's fresh, it's young, it's virile. But once it's gone and, you know, bear 2 generations of fruit of children, you know, it sees its job done. It's passed on its reproductive material, and so it's just going to tap out and just become one with the environment. And so what you can do to answer that question is some people will go and take their cubes out and they'll have like a little raised bed in their backyard full of mulch, wood chips, and again, anything with carbon really. And then sometimes you'll get lucky and it'll throw off a third flush and it'll kind of start to spread out into the mulch that you lay it down inside of. If you get really lucky, the spores will fall down into that mulch, and then hopefully maybe a year, maybe 2 years from now, all of a sudden maybe you'll actually get some mushrooms, basically your own strain of mushroom growing out of that wood chip pile. And then there's other types of mushrooms that's a little bit more optimized for. I think, I'm trying to remember the name, Stratiferia or something like that. Mushrooms are basically like the ultimate raised bed. Wine cap mushrooms as well. Actually, I think this is the time to get wine cap mushrooms make a raised bed full of mulch, stick the little plugs that you would buy from, like Field and Forest, into that mulch bed, and then you let it basically overwinter inside that raised bed. Ideally, you throw like a tarp over it or something like that. And then all through the spring, it wakes up, starts colonizing that wood chips, and then by around July, ideally you have little wine cap mushrooms coming up in that same garden bed. Oyster mushroom, it's always a complete roll of the dice. You kind of never know what's going to happen with that one. If you are able to grow anything from your own spores, congratulations. Not a lot of people are fortunate to have that happen. It probably means you have a fantastic location. You may have a fantastic hand at cultivating mushrooms if you can go from spore to your own mycelium. Because that's really the key to keep your own operation going, is to know how to take it from spore to mycelium yourself. Because once you know how to do that, you can cut out the middleman, which is this. Because for any mushroom growing operation, this is your #1 overhead. We've mentioned before, the sawdust is free. Steaming up some water, well, that's not exactly the most, intensive thing possible. A little bit of electricity, maybe you just use some extra wood on your property, and you've basically turned your overhead to 0. But now, buying these things at $15 a pop with, $20 shipping for 4 bags of it, you need to start showing some results at that point. But if you are successful, with all these bags we have here today, we could easily grow maybe $500 or up to $1,000 worth of oyster mushrooms with it, if we had a really good technique. Now obviously this is purchased for the purpose of this workshop right here, and so we're gonna dial our expectations to, hey, let's grow maybe $5 with these oyster mushrooms with this kit today, because that's gonna be your goal. Your goal is to just get one little cluster like that. Maybe it only gets 3 times as big, and once it gets this big, it's exponential. This thing will literally transform overnight. If you were to look at the same bag tomorrow, you wouldn't even recognize it. It moves fast once it gets there. So, any other questions? And then I just need to check the time.
What's the bucket for? If you're growing it in the bag, what's the bucket for?
This is where all our pasteurized substrate is. So obviously I don't have a pressure cooker right here that has enough sawdust in it to service all the workshop people here. So what I did is overnight I steamed up a whole bunch of sawdust, and then I let it cool, and then about a half hour before I came here, I bleached these buckets, and then I rinsed them, and then I sprayed them all with peroxide, and then I did not rinse them, and then I put the sawdust in there directly from the sterilized things. I went and I sprayed off my hands and did all this sort of stuff. Put it into the buckets. I made sure the lids also were sprayed with peroxide, and I sealed it up. So that's kind of how you do, growing mushrooms on the go for workshops like these. And that's also why I use oyster mushroom. It is the ultimate beginner. You may get tempted. This happens to a lot of people who want to get into mushrooms. They see, ooh, wine cap, shiitake, lion's mane. Oh, let's just order one of everything. Don't do that. Don't do that. Just get oyster. If you get good at oyster, and you can actually get a return on investment that you're comfortable with, and you want to make that your new little hobby, then you can go on to other strains. But don't go messing around with anything until you know how to do oyster. That is your official first level of this video game. You don't get to go to the second one until you get good on the first level. All right, and then I think, yes?
Do you have to steam it and pressure cook it, or just one or the other?
Well, ideally, I'd say pressure cooking, because that guarantees that steam is hitting everything evenly. Sometimes with steaming, if it isn't, the moisture content isn't homogeneous, meaning it's the same throughout, sometimes steaming it doesn't quite work out. And so even if it doesn't need to be like professional, so what I did in this particular one, it was inside that 55-gallon drum on top of the cinder block. So what I did is I put the lid on the drum, and then I put a cinder block on top. And that was my pressure cooker. Holds just enough of it that I know it's going to be the same throughout, but once the pressure gets to the point of, holy crap, explosion, it has the edges that it can kind of push and steam out. And that's pretty much my kettle. Once it was able to push steam past a cinder block sitting on top of it, I knew that there was probably more than enough heat and steam in there. And also, I can touch the lid and I can feel the heat and everything, so you'll know. Like I said, if you're ever not sure, just reach in there and give it a little tap. And if it's literally the sawdust is too hot to touch, mission successful. All right, yes, sir.
2 questions.
Please do.
Earlier you mentioned soaking these bags. you move so fast, I can't.
Yeah, sorry,
quite read-
I'm a bit of a,
I understand, but you said something about when it reached this stage, then you wanted to soak the bag?
yeah, so once it's fully colonized, sometimes it'll have used up a lot of the moisture in the bag, and then when you poke the hole, you're basically opening up to the atmosphere, and it's gonna lose all that moisture. So a lot of times you would just, get some nice clean water, drop it in, maybe you need to put a weight on top to get it to submerge properly, and you literally just, overnight, you just let it soak, completely submerged
So
in water.
the plastic is permeable to the water?
So this is after you poke the hole, and then
Okay.
and then this filter, it only allows just enough airflow that it traps a good amount of the moisture. I can't remember the exact micron size of the bags. And then I should add, these bags, these are not just ordinary, plastic bags. These were specifically purchased, for growing mushrooms, because what they are is, it's called autoclavable bags. An autoclave is basically a big pressurized chamber that, a lot of biologists and other stuff use to clean things off and get it super clean, like, again, high pressure and heat clean. So what you do is, when this sawdust was cooking, I put the bags just right on top, in with the sawdust. And then I just pasteurized it all together. So the bags are also cooling down with the substrate when it's in there. And one of these buckets, I don't remember which one, has all of the bags that we're gonna be using today. Now, it's also where the mess gets introduced, because when it collapsed, it caused the water to boil up, and so the bags are all covered in sawdust. So you're gonna have a little bit of sawdust, in your car seat when you're going home. And yes, your second question.
Second question then, talking about humidity in the environment. Is it possible to put these perhaps in a plastic bin with damp cloths on the bottom and partially covered to maintain?
Yes.
Would that work?
Yes, but with the humidity phase, that's when you're fruiting, and so you're gonna have these really fragile things coming off of them, so the tub can work. And the mushrooms are smart in that they will just fruit around whatever is next to them. So if you have these things, stacked all together like this, like the mushroom knows, and it's going to just kind of redirect and move itself, and just kind of grow and lean against the other bag, and then just kind of keep going. And so as long as you're not picking it up, moving it around a whole bunch, and there's a possibility that it may reach up and start pushing on that, damp cloth over time, yes, that could be a way of creating that environment. Because you're basically creating your own little humidity chamber at that point. So yeah, being makeshift with mushrooms, I'm fully in favor of. All right. Anyone who hasn't asked a question yet, and then all people who have a second question I'll follow up with. Anyone? All right, we'll do just another minute or two of the Q&A. Yes.
I did.
She wanted to know how big.
Yeah, how big can the mushrooms go up?
Well, that comes down to how much substrate you have in your bag and how much time that you give it. So today, you're all basically going to be getting a little sampler bag. It's going to be just enough to make like a little cute little cluster of mushrooms. Like I said, maybe about this size, because this one was triggered early. So I think it would kind of equate to about something about this size. About this size of mushroom, yeah, about one cluster, let's say maybe a ½ pound to a ¼ pound. Now there's a formula for how much sawdust to how much pounds of mushrooms you can expect, but I can't remember that right now, but luckily I think we all have internet access, and I think I've given you plenty of starting points to kind of go down the rabbit hole on your own. Yes?
When you do the second batch, let's say we're gonna try our second batch, we're gonna harvest those mushrooms, do we seal that hole and treat it sterile again, sterile again, or
I've
do
kind of
we
wondered
leave
this.
that hole open and?
So a lot of times I'll it depends, because it's all about a pattern. Once you do it enough, you know exactly what to expect. Some people, they'll leave it and just expect the second round to come through that same hole, and they leave it. But let's say for like this one right here, like it didn't fully colonize all the way, so I think I will tape up this one and basically force it and be like, no, you finish what's on your plate and then you can come out and fruit into a mushroom and whatnot. I don't know if that'll work. It may, and this is where there's kind of a sort of an art form with it. I don't really know what the mushrooms will do. Maybe it'll be like, nope, too late, I'm already diverted my, fungal processes to fruiting, like there's no going back now. Maybe it will be like these things right here, because what you'll notice with these things is eventually they'll kind of like die and wither and then just kind of shrivel up as they're sort of re-siphoned back into like the collective of the mycelium. So I can't really say, and that's where I say experiment with yourselves, and that's kind of also the judgment, like, so since this one's fruiting and it's not fully colonized, I'm taping it. Something like this it's so like brick white, I would just leave that same hole. If anything, once it gets done, maybe re-soak it again, if it seems like it's really dry. And then if you do soak it, when it has a hole in there, make sure you are draining off all the water. It needs pooled water. Pooled water is also another eternal enemy of the mushroom because it's creating an environment for that pathogenic stuff, basically anaerobic water, water that is without oxygen in it. It will kill your garden plants and it will kill your edible mushroom growing operation as well. Alright, yes?
I have done a little bit of research and I went online and I went to Amazon and they sell box kits. Could you do a little evaluation of that?
So those are
versus this?
great, it's just for the same cost of a box kit, you can buy a whole one of these, which is enough to do. Now, a box kit would probably be about this size right here. So, $15 for this, or $15 in order to turn all of this. Probably enough for about maybe 6 of these bags filled, maybe 8 of these bags filled, maybe 3 times as much. So it's a cost effectiveness type thing. That's great that's good for having that initial yes experience. I would say the pre-done, pre-colonized mushroom kits, that's the, let's see, the training wheels. Training wheels of mushroom growing. If you can make one of those kits successful and you're happy with the results, then you work up to maybe going on to Field and Forest or North Spore and buying your own like little 2-pound bag of mycelium, and then doing a little bit of kitchen countertop pasteurization of some extra wood chips you got from a friend with a mulcher. You stop at one of these aforementioned businesses. And then you get into buying all the racks, setting up in your basement, getting little fluorescent lights, 55-gallon drums, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, see you in the back. One last one. Oh no. Does anyone else have a final question? We give her one last stall?
Does
Yes.
the quality of the sawdust make a difference? I just used a chipper and I ground up maple and oak, but it had a lot of lichen on the bark.
No. So things like lichen introduce nitrogen. And so what happens is if there's too much lichen, it's basically a ratio. A little bit of lichen, no. It would have no effect on it. It's really just the type of wood. If all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a little bit of pine mixed in there. And then it's like, okay, well now we're altering the chemistry because of the different pH. And if you don't know this sort of side of things, stay after and I can give you a quick impromptu pH chemistry lesson. But basically, you have your acidic and you have your basic. And mushrooms definitely have a preference. And that's why you kind of have to be specific with the wood type sometimes. And unless, of course, you're dealing with straw. Straw is another really popular substrate because you can literally get big bales of it, real cheap, real easy. And then people have gotten clever and figured out how you can use basically a weed whacker to chop up the straw into more manageable chunks, and then you treat it just like sawdust. But some people do basically high pH. I think they use some sort of like calcium carbonate mixture or something like that to basically lye, pH of lye, and they basically use the super high pH to pasteurize it and kill off everything, because oyster mushrooms don't mind a little bit higher on the pH scale of things. But I have to be careful not to go off into a huge tangent because it just goes on and on from there. So hopefully that answers the question just enough. But it sounds like, yes, I think it would work. And different consistencies of wood chips doesn't matter. If you have pellets that are 1.5 inches, if you have literally ultra-fine sawdust like what we're using today, that's totally fine. If you do use sawdust or bales of straw, I also recommend maybe going to Keweenaw Country Store and picking up some of their cheap wheat bran in just the little bulk bags and mixing that in maybe 10%. And what that does is it provides just enough nitrogen that the mushrooms are happy. And so again, with lichen, it may even make better substrate for them. You really just have to try it. That's the one thing I really stress is, you know, your substrate, your growing conditions, your sterility of your technique, every one of us is gonna be a little bit different, so there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. For those of you who garden, it's very similar to gardening in that same way. The microclimate, the temperature, the air breeze direction, where the sun rises and sets, all those little things like can alter things in the most subtle of ways sometimes. So I wanna try not to say a one-size-fits-all approach on how to do this.
So you just said a mixture of straw and wheat bran? Just to make sure. I
Yeah,
got that
straw, wheat bran, some people use cottonseed hulls. That's be another one I really recommend internetizing. Just go on the internet and just type in substrate mixes for oyster mushrooms, or perfect recipe for oyster mushrooms. Well, actually that's gonna throw you a whole bunch of cooking recipes. That's why using the words like substrate is important, because that helps narrow the search algorithm to not throw you off into, you know, how would you like to cook these oyster mushrooms, which is gonna be most of your results anyway, most likely. Alright, oh, do you remember?
Yes, can you use a thermostat instead of having to use your hands and burning them?
You could, but that's why I like just letting it sit overnight, and then you don't have to worry about that anymore. Because no matter what, it has to cool down enough for the mushrooms. So it's gonna need to cool down enough for your hands at some point anyway. And the hands, you know, as long as you're being clean and scrubbing everything and you've got your alcohol spray nearby, that's gonna be the least of your issues. Otherwise, I really recommend just getting nitrile gloves. And then that way, you know, the alcohol isn't tearing up your hands like it tears up my hands, because it will dry out and make your hands really bad over time. Because if you're spending an hour, you know, doing all these mushrooms, you're spraying every single time that you're reaching out for something, like it does get some long-term damage in the hands. So I'll put that little disclaimer out real quick. So, any final questions before we all wash our hands? Yes?
The bags that you have for the sawdust today, they contain the sawdust, so if we put it in the Instant Pot, we don't have to worry about the sawdust clogging the vents.
Yes, you could put the sawdust in the bags and then pasteurize them inside the bags, but eventually you are going to need to open those bags, get this in here, and the key to mixing this with that is kind of getting that even consistency. And so the problem with that, and why I don't personally do that one, is because then I have to pour in the mycelium and then basically like mix it inside of the bag. And then I've got my forearms in there and I'm doing all this mixing, and the whole point of doing that was for a better aseptic technique, better sterility. And so in order to get this stuff mixed in there, you kind of have to work against that now. And so I found that it's easier to just have it sterile here, and then we're gonna do the lasagna technique. You're gonna put in a little handful of spawn, and then you're gonna do a couple handfuls of substrate. And then we're just going to layer it one after the other until we get up to about this height right here. And then, that's it, we'll be good. And then I'm gonna trust you all to try to get it right about here. With the kids, they'll be doing a slightly different ratio, because their hands are a little bit smaller. And then I'm just going to, basically when the kids come up here, and ideally, we'll have all the 16 and under go first, because they're gonna have the hardest time of making this work, because they're inherently gonna be a little dirtier than the rest of us sometimes. And it's also much more important for the young kids to have that yes experience, especially at this young age. For you older adults, I'm gonna assume that you're at the emotional maturity that if this doesn't go 100% as planned, that it is not going to destroy your world and make you off-put to doing mushrooms ever again. It is the younger people that need to have that yes experience in order to get them to really carry with it. Yes.
Librarian here. So I know all of you are going to make a mad dash to the bathrooms. We have 2 fully functional sinks in the room.
Perfect.
So I would recommend, rather than going to the bathroom and then touching a door to get out, that we rinse off our hands in here, and that way, if you want more tables to be set up while people are lined up washing hands, we
That's
can
perfect.
sort that out.
Yes, that is the,
Just
ideally the flow
putting that
is
out
wash
there.
hands, go to the station, and then what we can do is even do more Q&A while that happens. And then I just need to be kind of overlooking and making sure that, usually when I do these workshops, it's making sure that people don't, you know, while they're waiting in line. Huh? Yeah, I'm ready. Alright. And also, you don't need to worry about stuff that comes from you. We humans don't generate anything that is of concern with these guys right here. And if you are producing something out of your lungs that is of concern for these guys in here, you have greater issues, because you're not supposed to be breathing black mold, soil bacteria, and other stuff inside of you, so, I don't know. If anything, if you do have some weird stuff growing yours and no one else does, I don't know. Some other research needs to be done, yes?
Why not just wear sterile gloves, like surgical gloves?
You could, and that's usually what I recommend, but, you know, it's doing stuff on a budget, maybe you don't have those gloves handy.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And even if you do have the gloves, you still wanna do the alcohol spray, just because that kills anything that might have fallen in it, because there's a lot of equipment going on. You know, you have these bags, and then once the bags are done, it also has to be vacuum sealed as well. And so each one of these points, we're slowly and steadily adding all these different little variables that can happen, and so, going, I guess, back to the COVID thing, like, even if you have the gloves, you still wanna be a little bit paranoid about things. But otherwise, yes, I highly recommend nice sterile gloves, and so as I'm plugging this in, I'm also blocking this off. Quick note on how to use my pressure sealer right here.